Around the time I was 14 years old, so probably grade 8 or something like that, I remember being given an assignment by one of our teachers where we were supposed to research a historical event and then present it to our class. But the historical events could only be chosen from like a hand-picked list of events that all carried a theme with them, which is that they were these morally reprehensible actions and events that we were supposed to learn some kind of moral lesson from. So from that list of pre-approved events, there were things like the Salem witch trial, or the Spanish Inquisition, or the Crusades, or the Galileo affair. So if you're familiar with those, you're probably picking up on what the theme was. Each of these events, along with some of the others that I didn't mention, are the kind that persist in the popular subconsciousness of the modern world as examples of a person or a group of persons who we've refashioned into our own likeness as individuals who we see as having been victimized by the backwardness of their day. We say things like, they were ahead of their time. And what we mean by that is that they were closer to the sensibilities of our age than that of the age that they found themselves, or at least that's what we think when we refashion them in our own image. What exactly being born later in a sequence of time has to do with being ahead of anybody else is beyond my ability to understand, but that's a bit of an aside. So what is the story of Galileo? Well, Galileo, as we all know, was an astronomer who put forward an idea now known as heliocentrism, which is this idea that the Earth, as well as he believed the entire universe, revolves around the sun. And that stands in contrast to geocentrism, which was the idea that everything revolved around the Earth. And geocentrism was the popular belief in Galileo's day because of superstitious religious fundamentalism that people like scientific men like Galileo were trying to liberate humanity from. And sure enough, as soon as he started to put forward his observations, the Catholic Church jumped in and tried him for heresy in an attempt to suppress those ideas and keep the masses locked into their religious worldview. Something like that is what seems to be popularly believed by just about anybody with any familiarity with that historical event. And for those who don't have any familiarity, they still seem to be nurturing popular ideas about how Galileo was this scientific freethinker who was unjustly persecuted by the rigidity of the Catholic Church. The truth is, the Church upheld the geocentric view because it had been convincingly demonstrated by the scientific establishment. And it enjoyed scientific consensus beyond the boundaries of just Christian culture. Both people like Ptolemy and Aristotle had persuasively argued in favor of geocentrism. And Galileo had actually failed to overcome one of the most persuasive arguments against his heliocentric model, which came from Aristotle, who argued that if the Earth was in motion, then we would witness something called a stellar parallax among the stars relative to our position as the Earth moved. And since we didn't observe that stellar parallax, it must mean that the Earth is static. And that's worth pausing on, because just like the anecdote that I shared earlier, my education experience was one that led me to believe that people didn't know things like the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun, because they were generally more stupid than us and that we are more highly evolved and quite a bit better looking than they were. But here we have Aristotle making astronomical observations 2,400 years ago and putting forward a very compelling and very interesting and intelligent argument, which is to say that when you are in motion, you notice that there's a parallax effect. So if you're traveling down the road and you're looking out towards a bunch of trees over a landscape, you'll notice that some move relatively to you at a different rate. So if the Earth was in motion, we would see this parallax effect in the stars. And since we couldn't, then that meant that the Earth wasn't moving. Now, he was wrong, but still, that's an incredibly intelligent and articulate response to alternative theories, which they had considered. And because there was convincing scientific evidence in support of geocentrism, the Catholic Church would often interpret scripture in the Bible with that understanding in mind. And this is because the Catholic Church believes in something called fide et ratio, which means faith and reason in Latin. And this means that the Church has always been perfectly happy to interpret divine revelation, which is how God reveals truth to us, through the logical lens of evidence offered by even non-Christians like Ptolemy and Aristotle. This was not an example of scripture and the Bible and theology against science, or that old conflict thesis of religion versus science. This was an example of science versus science, which was then reinforced by scriptural interpretation and the prevailing scientific worldview of that day, which had been held for generations and centuries. The church isn't anti-science. In fact, the church has always been a great patron of the science because of its commitment to the pursuit of truth. The fact is, the church is and was so pro-science and so in favor of rational exploration that in order to ensure its validity, sustainability, and its integrity, she would hold science to the highest level of scrutiny, which is to say that she would not allow anything to be published as scientific fact unless it had been convincingly demonstrated. So in the case of Galileo, even though his conclusion was mostly right, he hadn't yet proven it, and the church wouldn't allow something to be taught as if it had been proven when it hadn't. And in fact, many of his supporting premises, that is, the way that the observations that he made to get to that conclusion, were completely false. He believed things like the reason that there are waves and tide in the ocean is because the earth is moving, and that's how fluctuating the water around, which was totally false and kind of a ridiculous argument and really didn't win him much assent and favor from among his peers in academia. And I can understand why many of us and many people might lament this scrutiny that the Catholic Church put science under as a sort of a rigid restriction on the freedom of inquiry. But on the other side of that, look what's happened to science since we've lost that kind of scrutiny. For example, we now have to rely on journalists to mediate scientific discoveries and publications to us. And so we always end up with headlines that say things like, "New scientific study suggests that maybe something is true." It's never a conclusive statement, and it's almost always something that has been cherry-picked out of the bin of research because it makes for a provocative headline. Or what about the fact that according to Stanford medical researcher John Ioannidis, about 90% of what gets published in medical journals being the new level of scrutiny that is supposed to guarantee the integrity of science, 90% of what gets published in medical journals is wrong. That means that only 10% of what is claimed to be medical fact is actually factual. The Catholic Church, who was the first to establish universities and hospitals in Europe for the benefit of Europe's citizens, considered itself responsible for the scrutiny of science as a result. And without that oversight, science has become plagued by the interests of political, especially funding, as well as multinational pharmaceutical companies. The Galileo story is relentlessly recited and rehearsed by people who want to propose that the Catholic Church has always been systematically opposed to science and reason and would do whatever it could to persecute scientists that it feared would, through their inquiry, undermine its superstitious and religious beliefs. Let's think about that for a second. The Catholic Church was one of the, if not the most dominant force and authority in Europe for over 1,000 years, which is longer than any human dominant empire has lasted. If in that time the church was actually actively pursuing an agenda of persecution against scientists, there would be countless cases that we could draw from as examples to reinforce this. But whenever you actually ask for examples to reinforce this popular narrative that the church has always been anti-science, those advocates always fall upon the same few flimsy examples, of which Galileo is the first triumphant example that escapes their lips. And in the case of Galileo, it's based on historical revisionism. For comparison's sake, why don't we look at what an actual aggressive persecution of a people by a reigning government authority looks like? So how about the Soviet Union, who was the atheistic communist authority ruling over people in Europe and Asia for almost 70 years in the 20th century? As part of its agenda to achieve an atheistic utopia, it systematically persecuted Christians for their belief in God to the tune of estimates as high as 20 million deaths. That is a number so incomprehensibly large that it overwhelms our ability to be attentive to any one individual case from within it. And Stalin himself is supposed to have said that one death is a tragedy, but 1 million is a statistic. Let's say for a second that the popular narrative about Galileo was true and that he really was a victim of the anti-scientific attitude of the Catholic Church. Well, the reason his case stands out so vividly is because it was so exceptional. The reason it's a tragic tale is because it was so rare. If this kind of thing happened as often as Christians were murdered by atheists in the 20th century, then we would be utterly desensitized to it. The only thing that we could offer in recognition of their fate would be a staggering statistic. But since there are only a few, then it is evidence and that we have to conclude that these are exceptional instances of injustice. The Galileo affair is well known because it is exceptional, and it is exceptional because it is rare. Thank you so much for watching that, you guys. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing and hitting that bell if you're on YouTube, or just liking and following from wherever you are and wherever you happen to be watching this from. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting my work as a digital media and marketing expert. My company, Holdsworth Design, is a branding and communications company that specializes in web design and logo and branding, graphic design, videography, and communications and marketing strategy. So if you know of a parish or a diocese or a business or a ministry that needs help in those areas, then please send them our way, and I'm sure that we can probably help them out. And be sure to check out the website, which is holdsworthdesign.com.